Before the major social platforms launch a new product, they'll often run small experiments within a subset of their users to test it out. More often than not, the first person to spot these new products is a guy named Matt Navarra, and his many scoops have been cited in thousands of news articles over the years. Matt got his career start running the digital communications for the UK government and then later became the director of social media for the Next Web. In 2018, he struck off on his own and launched his own marketing consultancy. It was that same year that he began writing Geek Out, a weekly newsletter that curates emerging news and information around the marketing industry. Within a few months, it amassed thousands of subscribers, and today it drives six figures in revenue, mostly through sponsorships. In my interview with Matt, we talked about where he gets his product scoops, his audience growth strategies, and how he built a six-figure newsletter business as basically a side hustle. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, now on to my interview with Matt. Hey Matt, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So you run a really popular newsletter called Geek Out. It's about social media marketing. Let's start talking about like your expertise in social media marketing. How did you first get involved in that industry?
So I didn't really go down a traditional route, if there is such a thing for social media jobs. I did a degree in business and marketing in 2002, and I did a number of jobs between 2002 and 2009, where I was working for a bank in London as a bank marketing manager, and I trained to become a teacher at one point, and I did a bit of traveling, not really knowing what I wanted to do or what I was particularly good at. And then it wasn't so long after I kind of come back from traveling and I'd done a few jobs, and I realized that maybe ADHD could be an issue for me, because I was getting messages from former bosses that hated me and about the issues they had. And I was also noticing that certain things at work weren't making sense. I was really good at some things that were really complicated, but really bad at some basic stuff, and it really was confusing. So at the time when I found out that ADHD was actually a thing for me, and I tried some of the medications, I also started a new job for the British government in civil service, and I was meant to be a press and PR comms manager, looking at writing press releases and scripts and for speeches for ministers and things. And it was just around then that there was social media certainly for brands was well established, but for governments was very much in its embryonic stages. And so I just took up the role of building social media accounts for this big government department under the table, and not doing what my boss had told me to be doing. And I can elaborate on that. And it kind of snowballed from there as my entry route into the world of social media.
Yeah, like really young people won't really know of this era, but there was this like small unit of time around like 2008, between 2008 and 2012, where like all internet stuff was just given to the youngest person in the office, regardless of if they had any kind of experience in it, and all of a sudden they were managing all the social media accounts, and a lot of like today's social media marketers kind of came out of that era. Was that what it was like with you, as you were just like this young person in the room, and they were like, okay, you can go do this Facebook and Twitter thing?
Well, yeah. So I'd had by this point like 5 to 6 years working in industry. I, had a degree. I had a degree in business and marketing, so quite a generic degree. And I'd come in to do a specific role for the government in terms of this press PR role, which was at the time probably a low to middle management grade, I would say. It was at okay earnings, I would suggest. And then and I started to, as the guy that was interested in tech and was kind of already kind of doing stuff on Twitter and Facebook on my own time, became the default person to do social media or to be doing things related to anything tech in the office. And because the civil service is heavily weighted with lots of people who've been sitting on office chairs in there for years, making lots of money on fat salaries and not really interested in progressing the civil service, I was probably the youngest person in the building. So it fell to me, and I started building some Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, and I had some ideas for us to do some collaborations with a TV show called Dragon's Den, which for you is the equivalent of Shark Tank, I think. And they didn't want to do it, and I suggested it'd be a great tie-up for social as well. And a long story short is that was a really good collaboration with the BBC, and it impressed a few people. And then I started to get noticed a bit more in government, because I was one of the early starters in government of doing social media for a big government department. And that's when I started getting some inquiries about doing other things. And actually, the reason why I ended up working in Downing Street for the Prime Minister and then doing stuff for the Cabinet Office is because I sent an email one day I found the name on LinkedIn of the Director of Digital for the Cabinet Office, the Government Digital Service, a new team that was looking after social and digital, and said that I was really not enjoying my job and I really wanted to do more, and I felt that I was worth more and I could do more. And would she, help me in any way? I had no idea who this person was, this woman. Her name was, God, do you know what? It escapes me. It'll come back to me. But she was a great woman. And then she pulled me in to spend some time working in London for a secondment in the Cabinet Office. Emma Coleman was her name. And that was the beginnings of my route into much more kind of high profile social for the government, which started to build a small name for myself in a geeky government social circle, I guess.
And then you eventually leave the government to work for the private sector. You go to work for a blog called The Next Web. And this was an era, Next Web was among these crop of like up and coming tech blogs like TechCrunch, VentureBeat, Read Write Web. This was an era when tech was becoming an important sector, but a lot of the major media companies hadn't really invested in their tech reporting, and a lot of the biggest stories, like TechCrunch broke the story that Google bought YouTube. Like a lot of the biggest stories in tech were happening on these blogs, and today a lot of the biggest stories in tech are being broken by mainstream news outlets because they eventually woke up to the power of tech and started hiring really talented journalists. You go to work for The Next Web. How did you do? Was that just like, I think the guy who ran it, his name was Z something or something like that. How did that job come about?
So again, I've been very fortunate in terms of being in the right place at the right time, and then having been in that right place at the right time, exploiting that moment. And I think this is one of those moments because Z, as you mentioned, who was the CEO or chief in charge at the time of the Next Web, was a connection of mine through my wife. So she went to school with him, and I sort of only just started to get to know him a year before I ended up working for the Next Web, and he knew of my role that I was doing and the things I was doing for government. And I think originally they asked me if I would be write about social media and tech for them, and I was like, I don't feel confident in my ability to write. I'm not a trained journalist, and I actually would find it pretty boring to write all day long. So I said that's not for me. So then they reapproached me a bit later on and said basically, look, we want you to just. We've got no social team. We've got no structure, no strategic vision for that. And we want someone to come in and just own it and take it on and do it. We'll give you complete autonomy. There's there's no rules really. This is a really hip and up and coming kind of company that's not going to be traditional in any shape or form. Come and have a look. So I was pretty sure I was going to take it because I was getting frustrated in the government role, and I kind of fed up with the sort of things I was doing, and I couldn't see anywhere else I wanted to go in government roles. So I went and had a look. They're based in Amsterdam, and so I've never worked from home at this point before, and I've never worked for a company that was abroad, so it was a bit of a kind of jump in the dark. And I went over there, and it was a bit like a typical WeWork space with real sort of creative kind of spirit about it. Lots of people that were basically there from day one. They were staff numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., up to about, I think I was staff member number 16 or something. And so they showed me around the place, and the boss of the company, or one of the co-founders, is a guy on Twitter called @Boris, who often obviously gets tagged for thinking that he's Boris Johnson. It's not, it's a different Boris. And he is an incredible guy, and Patrick, the other founder as well, and just said, just do what you want to do, and you'll have a blast. So I quite quickly said, fine, I'll come and do it. And then I think my first week or first few days on the job, they said, come to Amsterdam because the Next Web conference, which I hadn't really heard of at this point, is starting. We need somebody to do some social. This is a small event, won't be a big deal. Just do what you can. So I got there. No people, no social team, no strategy, and this small event was, I think, 3,000 to 4,000 people, which for me was quite intimidating. So I live tweeted that first event. By the time I left 6 years later or 5 years later, that event was a 2-day event with 25,000 people coming, and it was close to being the kind of second and third in line to Web Summit in terms of scale. So that was my entry route into the Next Web, and the period at the Next Web was a very formative period, I think, in my career.
Yeah, so like working for the government tends to be kind of not very forward thinking and kind of conservative. You were probably limited in terms of creativity. Working for the next web, I mean, it was kind of, I think, a lot of young people, like they were kind of just inventing things as they went, and it sounds like you had a lot of autonomy. What were some of the things that you were able to do at the next web from a social media perspective in terms of experimentation? Like, and this was also an era when Facebook was really like throwing the gasoline on the fire in terms of really heavily featuring Facebook pages and stuff like that. So what were some of the things you got to do while you were at the next web?
Well, you said at the beginning about the TechCrunch and others like that, those being sort of big names at that point in time for tech news. And what I found quite quickly early on was that Boris and Z had a phenomenal skill at picking people that were very good in the roles that they picked them for. And many of the people that ended up working as writers, journalists, reporters for the Next Web ended up being most of the team at TechCrunch or some of the other world's biggest tech blogs. So there was the stars of tech reporting now. Many of them kind of had a route via the Next Web. So it was nice to be part of that kind of gang. But yeah, when I got there, as I say, there was no one there. There's no team. So within the 5 years that I had, I hired a number of people in the team. So by the point when I left, we had, three, four, five people that were working on social, a couple of people doing video. We had a much more well orchestrated and well oiled machine between the editorial team and the social team, and then the sales and branded content teams, which wasn't, there was no structure to that at all. And also sort of they gave me quite a nice amount of involvement in and a role to play in terms of editorial. And I found I wasn't expecting to, but kind of found that I was quite good at spotting what stories could make for an interesting story for them to cover, although I couldn't write it myself, in terms of coming up with headline ideas and thinking like this is an obscure, silly thing that's kind of bubbling up on Twitter that I can see can easily be made into a story and will be a big traffic magnet. So there was a lot of kind of engagement between me and the editorial team, and I'm thankful that all of the editors in chief and writers there were kind of open to that. And then the other big part of my job was the Next Web conference, which ballooned every year, bigger and bigger. I think on one of the final years that we did it, I did it first of all on my own. By the end of it, it was a 6 to 8 month lead time of me planning out what we were going to do for those 7 days of the week of the event and the 2 days of the actual event. And hired a team of about 15 temporary team members to come on board to create content, to schedule content, to kind of do everything you needed for a team that was running a social media operation for a huge technology event. And I think on one of the final years, we had about 600, I might get these numbers wrong, but it's certainly 800 million social media impressions across all channels in 7 days from the work that we were doing. So that was a huge operation. And what I found in that time that and you mentioned about Facebook and stuff is quite an interesting one, because there was a lot of volatility between news publishers and Facebook, particularly in terms of what Facebook wanted from news publishers and what news publishers wanted from Facebook, which typically was distribution and reach and lots more traffic. And at the time, Facebook was kind of saying, you need to use instant articles and this is the best thing ever and this is what you need to be doing. And that caused problems as much as it helped with things. And then equally, the famous pivot to video sort of push that they made, which didn't really work out. And there was lots of people that went under as a news operation because of that. So you're meddling with all of that at the same time, as well as negotiating with Twitter and ways to use Twitter moments and thinking of how maybe Pinterest could be a way that news publishers could get more traffic, as well as growing an audience. So it's a hectic, crazy, non-stop busy role. And just to wrap that up, my time with Boris and Patrick was great, because when I didn't know what I was doing and I was asking them, what should I do? And I'm worried if I do this, it's going to really piss people off and we could really upset people in our audience, or we could get in trouble for saying some of this stuff, because I didn't know whether coming from government that would be acceptable, because we couldn't do some of this stuff. And so there would be many a time when I'd Slack message Boris and Z and Patrick, and they would sort of say, yeah, fuck it, just do it. Yeah, just do it, whatever. And eventually, I think they pulled me to one side and said, look, keep doing whatever it is you want to do. We know that you can do it. You don't need to ask for permission, just ask for forgiveness, to the point where we get told that we're going to be sued in court. that's the line. When you get someone that tells you something along that level, that's when you need to come to us. Until that point, just keep doing your shit. And that gave that level of ability to control my own destiny and create the team I wanted to create, and not fear if it's screwed up or whatever. It made it really fun, and we did some. There were some very funny stories for that whole 5 year period.
When Facebook started inflating views on for video, did the next web, did your team start producing more video for Facebook?
Well, that was one of the challenges, I think, for the next web, and I don't think they would be upset for me to say that during that time that we were still a fairly lean operation, and we weren't part of the bigger giant media conglomerate, and we didn't have the resources in terms of manpower or financial resources really at that time to kind of have an army of video creators or have all of the other sort of assets we needed to kind of run such an operation. And the ones that did have that or somehow found the scale to do that, kind of many of them, it backfired on them, and in the end, a lot of people lost jobs, and a lot of the publishers went under for it. So for us, we kind of knew that we were never going to really be able to scale video at that time to the way that others were. So we had to be more smart with what we were doing, in terms of the way that we engage with our audience. And I think the thing that we focused on at the time was we can spend hundreds of thousands on stuff to do with video production at this time, but what we can do within our limits is really develop a massive audience in terms of our community and have real strong engagement with that audience, develop a very distinct tone of voice and a very distinct personality that sets us apart from everybody else at very little cost. And also we can find the right pieces of content and the ideas for content that are really going to fly on across all social channels, even if we don't have the video capacity to do it in a video sort of way. And I think that carried us through that period really well. And we had, like a lot of publishers at the time, traffic from Facebook for us was always very sporadic. It was, you suddenly get like within like minutes of having normal levels of traffic on Google Analytics, it would suddenly jump to like hundreds of thousands of people suddenly coming from Facebook. And you're like, how's this suddenly blown up so quickly? And then it would quickly just disappear. And we had that a lot. But we as a publisher found that those spikes were far more frequent from things like Hacker News or Reddit. I remember us sitting there in the office some evenings till late and going, shit me, look at the traffic that's coming from Reddit. And suddenly we would just go from having 20, 50, 60,000 people on site real time up to, I think on one time we had like double-digit millions on one day, which was on this crazy, and it was a really bizarre non-story that we thought. So that those spikes, although we did get them from Facebook and things, they were far less frequent, and also I think felt very much harder to bring about and control and influence in quite the same way as maybe other channels.
And eventually, you were there till 2018, and that was after Facebook kind of pulled the rug out and started taking its foot off the gas in terms of sending traffic to publishers. And a lot of publishers started getting really serious about, now that they were suffering from this whiplash, serious about newsletters and owning their audience. Before you left the Next Web, did you start kind of taking over? Was that your department to try to figure out what email newsletters were going to do for the publication and stuff like that?
So the newsletter bit, I think, although for many publishers had already kind of started in terms of it becoming a bigger deal and being more valuable, when I was just sort of leaving the Next Web, that was becoming a part of their editorial output. And some of the newsletters that were being developed at that time have gone on since for them and been very successful. So it kind of, for me, I missed that phase of the massive expansion of the newsletters part of the editorial output. But certainly, and by the end of my last couple of years of my time, video became a much more scalable thing. It became, the costs of doing it became lower, and the tools that we could get that became more affordable and easier to understand and use, even if you weren't a video professional. We had started to, we already knew by this point kind of what our audience liked about TNW, the Next Web brand, and the personality, and what content for us was always going to be successful. And then it was just trying to build upon that and hoping that over the preceding years that we'd increasingly do more and more video. And I think by the time I left in 2018, the video part of it was very much an established thing. We were later to it, not because we didn't know it was a big deal, but the cost of it became more realistic for us. And the business by that point, I think, had also grown to a size that it could justify the spend. The conference was a phenomenal success for the Next Web, and that made a big difference to their revenue.
So you left in 2018. After that, you decide to be your own boss. You decide to basically launch a consulting business for brands that need help with their social media marketing.
Yeah, I've been in that role. That's the longest period of time I've been in any job in my career at that point, like 5 years, and like the previous roles have been like 2 to 3 years max. And I was struggling in that final year or two with a couple of things. Like I think I was rubbing up against the new sort of editorial team a little bit in terms of what I felt the right way to go was, but that wasn't really a big issue. It was another thing. But the main reason was I just felt that there was nothing more to learn in that role, and there wasn't any more senior post. I created my job title and the role, and so the ceiling was kind of limited in that respect. And I also had realised, like, for me to be doing social media in a capacity in another company at the same level for the similar salary, the job roles were going to be far less frequent coming up, and I would have to move to London, or I'd have to live somewhere in a bigger built up area, and that wasn't a possibility for me at that time with children and things. So I spent the last year and a half, I think, well, maybe last year, speaking with the team, Boris and Patrick, and saying I kind of wanted to move on, and I was kind of looking at my exit strategy, and they kind of helped me kind of come to that decision, and it was mutual. But I remember going to South by Southwest conference. I used to do that every year for a number of years, and in that final year, every year I met up with people from the industry, the media industry that I knew from Mashable or from BuzzFeed and other places, and we'd meet up, and I'd say to them in that final year, I'm thinking of leaving the Next Web. This is the only way I'm going to maintain what I've got now, and to build upon it is to go freelance as a social media consultant type operation. What do you think? And all of the people I canvassed pretty much unanimously said, if anyone could do it, you probably could, because you built up this audience, which we haven't really talked about, but I built up this little following when I was at the Next Web, and that was going to prove to be a very important part of my ability to convert being sort of employed into being self-employed and consulting. And so that's when I made the leap eventually, and kicked off thinking that most of my time would be spent consulting, but that didn't quite work out the way I thought.
You built up a following mainly on Twitter, correct?
Yeah, so when I was at the Next Web early on, I kind of was always this guy who was opening up the Facebook app and other apps, and you get those little blue bubbles that would say, "There's a new feature. You can now add GIFs to comments," or whatever it would be. And I would screenshot it, and then I'd tweet and say, "Hey, this is this cool new feature," and people would be like, "Oh, that's really cool. I haven't got that. How have you got that? Whereabouts are you in the world? Maybe it's just in the UK or something." And so I kept doing that, and doing it across all of the apps, and there seemed to be an interest in it, like a very deep niche of people that found it fascinating or interesting or useful. And then I kind of started looking around. I found people that online that also had similar interest to me, but were more technically proficient at coding and hacking and sort of that kind of white hacking space. And I got introduced to a few people, and I think actually at the time got introduced to Jane Wong, who now many people will know as a very established, well-known kind of sort of decompiler of apps and revealing all sort of hidden bits and pieces. But Jane wasn't around at this time, and then I sort of got introduced to her, and that was another sort of kind of bit of the jigsaw that kind of helped me understand this area a bit more. And then finally at the Next Web, a couple of times near the end, they were kind of looking for, we get calls from the BBC or Sky News saying, "Can you have one of your tech people come on and be an expert on a news story for us?" And lots of people didn't want to do it because they felt a bit intimidated. And I said, "Well, I'll do it. It's fine." And that then got my name on the books of various news organizations. So when I came to leave the Next Web, I had this following of people that were interested in me sharing the latest features. I kind of built up a network of media people in tech and the media business as a whole. And then people knew of me because I've been on the TV and done a few bits. So when I said now freelance and I'm doing it for anybody, much to my surprise, and it was a surprise, the interest was far greater than I could ever hope for. And that was the beginnings of kind of going social consultant route and building upon that with the business.
Yeah, even though you explicitly say that you're not a journalist, you actually break news pretty often because you've gotten good at spotting product features, either ones like you said where there's a pop up, or I don't know if it's you or sources that you have. A lot of times these tech companies, there'll be hints in their code about upcoming features, and a lot of times you're the first one to spot that. You tweet about it, it goes viral, and then it gets cited in news sources. So that's helped you in terms of building up, a following. Like once you eventually, at some point, you launched a Facebook group called Geek Out, I believe. When, like, what was the thinking there, and how did you get that to go really big?
Well, I'll just quickly build upon that point you mentioned, which is a quite an important point, I think, about the
Yeah.
kind of being cited in articles. I think I quite quickly cottoned on, having worked in an editorial position and helping writers put things together and then finding sources of information, understanding that process, and I knew how the operational would work at TechCrunch and BuzzFeed. That knowledge, and then and quickly figuring out if I get quoted in my tweets embedded in a TechCrunch article or a BuzzFeed article or BBC, and then that will get mushroomed and picked up by other outlets who are just jumping on that news, and that's bigger, and that grows my audience. I knew that was a great free marketing tool. If I could keep doing that, even if I was already doing it as a general interest thing, I was fascinated in those features. I knew that if I kept on doing it, that there's no reason why that would stop happening, and that would always keep my name in the kind of spotlight in the circles that I kind of wanted it to be. So that was a key component of it all, and I still do that to this day. I think in terms of the Facebook group, I think if I remember rightly, I'd created a Facebook group in the last year before I left the next web, but I hadn't published the group. It was kind of a hidden group. And I changed the name multiple times where I'd been thinking about what we were going to do with it. And we started talking about how we could create a new community sort of as part of the next web's kind of online presence. And we never kind of figured it out. And I kind of abandoned it. And when I left, I realized I had this kind of group there, and I thought maybe I should just do something for me personally with it. So I fished around online for ideas for what to call it and what to house my kind of stuff that I was doing with these features and new features and stuff. And I stumbled upon this kind of Geek Out naming, so I named it that. And the kind of the idea or the genesis for the group really was where somewhere where people can go that's got a big distribution, a big audience, a big platform like Facebook, and you can go in there and it's free and people can chat amongst themselves because they're all in the same industry of social media, which is the kind of area I wanted to focus on, and help one another and be like agony uncles and agony aunts for each other with the problems that we all face as social media managers, but also as a place to keep up to date with the news and maybe share all of the new feature things all in one place. It's kind of just like a hub for all of that social media manager type stuff. And so there were things that existed that were like it, but either they were charged, they were free, or they were typically staffed by older white men. They were very much American Facebook groups, typical from what I could see. So I kind of thought, well, that there's definitely an opening there to do something with. And so that's where I started with it. And all of the promotion of it's just through my Twitter account and through LinkedIn and everything else that I do. And it very quickly, in a short space of 6, 12, 18 months, grew to sort of 12,000 people, members. And now we're, however many years further on, and we're at 30,000, and I've never promoted it in a paid fashion. It's all just gradual, incremental, organic sort of discovery.
The marketing industry, it's known for having a lot of spammy people work within it. How do you deal with it? And Facebook groups are specifically vulnerable to people who are trying to self promote and stuff like that. Has that been difficult for you in terms of like making sure only like good insights are served, are provided, and it's not just people just going in there to spam it?
Yeah, and that again, I think in the early days of the group, I hadn't quite realised how important curation was as part of it. In terms of, it's always been very finely curated by me. I've never really had. I've had occasionally had a moderator or a co-admin for the group, but any in an informal, loose basis, it's 99% of it is me, and it still is. And I kind of have a basic set of rules in there, which are nothing exciting, or unusual. Rules about, don't ask for contacts at, agents at Facebook, and that. Don't ask about verification. Stop asking about. Don't post spam and self-promotional stuff. All that kind of jazz is in there. But it is pre-moderated, so everyone has to submit a post, and then I'll look and I'll go through it every day, multiple times a day, and say, check the post. Yeah, that's fine. Yes, 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 yes. And then if there's anything that's self-promotional, or it's just anything that I just think I wouldn't want to see that in the group, or it's not useful, or it's outside the remit of what the purpose of the group is, it's not going to add any value. It doesn't get in there. But that's probably, I would say I say no to, out of every 10 posts, maybe one. It's not a huge number, maybe, and sometimes it's very few in a typical week. And I always give reasons for it, and I've never had anyone come back and saying that's bullshit. Why won't you let me? Normally, like, fair enough, yeah, it's a bit self-promotional, it's a bit spammy. So that, and also the questions for access to the group. So to join the group, you have to answer three basic questions, which are, where did you discover the group? What is it? Where do you work? And what's your job title? And that gives me that, plus the information the group Facebook gives you information about the people, is normally enough to make sure that the membership is curated. And now with the tools it gives you to auto moderate, and if they've been with Facebook on Facebook less than 3 months or X number of other things, it immediately just auto rejects. So that curation is a very important part of, I think, maintaining a healthy group.
Yeah, I run my own Facebook group associated with my newsletter. It's much smaller than yours, mainly because I only promote it at the bottom of my newsletter. But yeah, utilizing those extra tools, like at the questions, looking at how old their Facebook group. A lot of those spammers are pretty lazy. They won't even bother answering the question that you ask, and so it's pretty easy to weed them out. So you eventually decide to team up with one of your former Next Web colleagues and launch a spin-off newsletter from the Facebook group called Geek Out. What was the thinking there? So it's like a weekly newsletter you launched on review, correct? So like what was your kind of goal there?
Well, we had the group, and that had been popular, and it was fairly, for me, it didn't feel much of an extension of the work I was already doing, so it didn't take up too much of my time. But what people had been constantly saying to me in the group community was, and on Twitter, is that, Matt, you tweet a lot, and I do tweet a lot, and I post a lot to the group, and people nicely compliment and say, well, it's really useful, but actually I miss lots of the stuff you share, and I don't have time to kind of go back over it. Can you not just pull it all together? That would be great. And I always remember being in at the Next Web thinking, wish there was just one site or one destination I could go to where it had every bit of social media news in one place, and I didn't feel like if I didn't read all the other blogs, I was missing out. I just want it all together, so I kind of didn't have the FOMO of social media news slipping past me, and then I'm missing out on it. So that was kind of what I would have wanted, and I thought, well, okay, so how can we convert what it is that I'm sharing into a format that is people can pick up, get everything they need in one place, and feel sort of satisfied that everything is in there. And also, more importantly, I think, which is a key part of it all, is it with a bit of personality, and it doesn't feel like this is a work challenge, because no one who's a social media manager is going to read Geek Out for pleasure. Most people kind of, it's a useful thing, and it has a utility to it, but it doesn't have to be feel like a work task. It can feel a bit fun. So that's where kind of the personality part of it comes in. So that was kind of the idea of it. And we'd already had, prior to the newsletter, some success, because we threw out an idea for a podcast, and we didn't know what to do. We thought we should just do a podcast because everyone was doing podcasts. And I threw it out, and maybe we'll come on to talk about that. But that was phenomenally successful, from doing very little towards kind of making it success. We threw the idea out, and then Pinterest were kind of keen to kind of sponsor it, and that helped us early on with the newsletter, because we had a little bit of experience of how do we charge for things, and what's the value we're creating here, and how do we pitch that to kind of sponsors and stuff. So that was kind of the initial idea. And then, yes, you're right, Martin Bryant, who's the editor-in-chief at the Next Web when I was there, was someone that was based in the UK as well. I knew was a safe pair of hands, was also a very talented kind of editor and writer, and got what I was all about and knew what I was into. And so it seemed like a natural partnership, where I didn't want to write lots of long analytical stuff without, certainly not without support of a seasoned kind of journalist tech reporter, which is what Martin steps into to fill. And I also knew that there'd be quite a bit more work than I could take on my own to kind of produce a weekly newsletter with everything, because effectively the newsletter is us going through my entire Twitter feed for the whole of the 7 days previous and picking out every story and then placing it where it needs to go, which we'll maybe come on to.
So you send it once a week. It's a kind of long email. It's kind of like a roundup of news with some contextualization. There's definitely some breezy writing and stuff like that, but it's something that's kind of designed so that if you work in this space where you kind of have to keep updated on what's going on with all the various social media marketing platforms, that you should be able to like just read through this entire thing. It doesn't take super long, and you kind of come away with kind of like a holistic understanding of what's happening in all various like aspects of marketing.
Yeah, I constantly say to people who read the newsletter and come back and give me feedback on it and tell me what they like and don't like, that I'm unapologetically making it super long. It's intentionally kind of overflowing with information and articles and links and stuff. And I 100% know and expect that the people that read Geek Out or discover Geek Out do not read 100% of Geek Out. They will take the bits that are interesting to them. So the objective for me was like, how can we create a newsletter that has so much in there that no one's going to sit and read the whole lot because they'd be there for ages, but they can pick the bits they want. And so, we kind of just shaped it kind of like a funnel, and in terms of the structure of what stories go at the top versus the middle versus the bottom. And I should also say that something that inspired the Geek Out in terms of the style of it is there's a guy in the UK that people will know called Martin Lewis, who is a kind of like a financial household sort of budget expert, kind of helps you with money. And he has a very, very phenomenally successful newsletter called Money Saving Expert. And it comes out every week and it is so busy. There's so many links in there, so many different things to go to get money off and discounts, whatever. And I thought, well, that's what I want, but for Geek Out News, for stories through social media. So in terms of the structure of it, we start with kind of the biggest stories, a bit of personality at the start at the top of it, which kind of makes it feel personal because ultimately you're in someone's inbox and it needs to feel like you're having a one-to-one conversation. This isn't a broadcast medium in the same way as other things are. So there's a lot of personality injected early on. And at the very first links in that newsletter aim to be something that are broad appeal, very clickable, almost irresistible in terms of their clickability, and make it nice and light. It doesn't instantly feel like, oh, this is going to be a hard slog. And then we quickly go into kind of, these are the top stories that if you don't read anything else, this is what you need to read. And then we quickly flow down into kind of some light-hearted stories and round it off with the top section of kind of some useful kind of links you might not discover this week that I've spotted. And then the middle section is kind of, here's all of the analysis and my commentary or our opinions on these things, plus key stories that you need to know about in different aspects of social. And then by the end, in the final half or the final third of the newsletter, it then gets down to kind of like, we're not going to give you all of that. It's now just links. It's like, Meta, here's all the stuff that's happened with Meta. Here's a top story for Meta this week, and here's all the other stories with Meta. Here's Twitter, here's TikTok, here's Snapchat. And then by the end of it, it gets right to the end and it wraps it up with, here's the weekend reads, the long reads you can take for the weekend, a funny and finally story that kind of lightheartedly kind of ties it up in a nice bow at the end. And then at the very, very end, it's personality driven again. It's kind of like me speaking as me, signing off as me. So it feels like a personal newsletter, not a work newsletter. And that's how we approach it. And all of that's put together through a Google Doc that we start working on a Thursday morning. And then we finish by sort of Friday, middle of the day.
And both you and Martin, you have large social media followings. You already had that large Facebook group, so you probably were able to start with a pretty decent email list pretty quickly off the bat, I'm guessing.
So yeah, Martin, I can't remember what his following numbers are like, but certainly he's got a decent audience, and I have managed to build up one as well on a few platforms, and so that undoubtedly helped. And my fact that I've been on media a fair bit in news articles and other things that I've been doing all would have helped us in terms of that kickstarting it. And of course the podcast. So when we put it out, I think it was around like the April, May, June time of when we did it. I can't remember what year we're talking about, 2020 or something like that. A couple of years, 2.5 years ago, I said to myself, well, if we can get 1,000 subscribers in, say, the first 3 to 6 months, that would be good. That was what my aspirations were for it. And I generally thought I was scared that it would be like 200 or 300, and it was cruel, like a snail's pace to it. And 1,000 was done in like 6 days or something. It was completely surprised me. And then like 3 to 6 months, I think we probably would have been, again, this is off the top of my head, I would imagine we would have been around the sort of 4,000 mark by the time. So like massively overblown where we expected to be. And it continued to rise at a very linear growth rate up to where it is now, which is 24,000. And all of that is, again, it's organic. I've never placed any ads anywhere. I've not done anything where I've paid for someone to be a subscriber or promoted it in a paid social capacity. It's all through, I'll promote it if I do a webinar or I speak at an event here and there, or and people will write articles and mention, oh, this is a great newsletter and stuff. But again, I would treat, to me, that's still organic. I'm not paying to do that. It's just using the opportunities I get to push it.
Yeah, so like you have like tweets that go like super viral, and won't you like put them in a thread and then link to the newsletter, so then you get to like basically coast off that virality in terms of driving newsletter subscribers?
Yeah, anyone who works in social will know for Twitter that's one of many kind of growth hacks or whatever you want to call it in terms of getting kind of people to see something you want them to see. There's lots of people that spend all day just writing Twitter threads that are kind of like bro commentary, kind of like how to be, how I turn my life into such and such, and how I achieve this, and then here's all the things that I learned. And there's loads of them. We've all seen them before. I don't do that really. The threads that I do are, if there's a report that's to do with social media that's come out from Adobe or something, then I might take some bits of it and make it into a thread, but not in the thinking, right, I can make this go viral and then I can get people into my newsletter. It's just kind of like, I put that out, and if it works out, that's lovely, but it's not my biggest goal. The ones where I get the biggest gains from are nearly always the ones that are totally unexpected. Like I posted last week a clip of the ad that WhatsApp had done for an ad on Piccadilly Circus, which is quite an elaborate 3D kind of visual ad on a digital billboard. And I kind of saw it really early before anyone else had seen it. And I didn't know I'd spotted it earlier than everyone else, but I guessed I was pretty early. And so I just plonked it up on Twitter and a few other places, and just kind of carried on with my day. And I thought, it's racking up a few hundred, likes, that people find that, like me, find it interesting. And by the end of like day one, day two, that had reached like 1 million likes or 1 million views of the video. And so as soon as I realized that, then little tweets like that, I'll quite quickly think, right, how can I now reproduce that? Because there's clearly an interest on the other platforms before someone else does it anyway, and how do I tap into the traffic of that? And I'll stick a link somewhere. I'll find a way to shoehorn if you like that, you'll like this kind of mention, and that often adds several hundred, sometimes 1,000 plus subscribers to the newsletter on a really good one.
So from monetization standpoint, you are completely funded through advertising, right?
Yeah, we made a decision early on that and it was quite a tough decision because we had no experience, but certainly for newsletters, of should it be a free newsletter, should it be a paid newsletter? The obvious pros and cons in our heads were, right, if we do it paid, then we're going to build a sustainable, more stable, consistent level of income for us, and won't be so up and down with the whims of the ad industry, and that's a good thing. And maybe we can make more money doing it that way. Was one of the kind of main reasons we would have done it. And then we said, but equally, this is a new newsletter. We want as many people on this list as possible because we want lots of people reading it, because then lots of people will share it, and that will help kind of exponentially grow it. And if we do advertising and sponsorships, aside from whether we charge people for the newsletter, we will have that income stream only if there's a significant enough audience across a broad stream of people. And so and then I think the other thing was I didn't really want it to charge it, because I thought there's going to be loads of people that are out there that wouldn't be able to afford it and wouldn't be able to get access to the newsletter. And that was kind of against what I wanted when I was struggling as a social media manager. We wouldn't have had the kind of kind of budgets for some stuff. But then I thought, well, maybe people will expense it. So there was a lot of indecisiveness. But we went on the free route, a free newsletter. It seemed to work, and then we decided that it would be a sponsor and we'd have ads, and that was when the kind of fun began, because we had no idea. Should we have one sponsor? Should we have three? Should it be a flagship sponsor and they have their branding on it? But what else are we giving sponsors as a perk? One ad, two ads, shout outs? I have no idea. And then ad wise, do we just have one generic ad type and that's what we sell, or do we have different tiers of advertising? How do we price it? What does it look like? Do they have images? Do they not? So all of these decisions we had no idea about, and a lot of it was finger in the air. We had, and speaking to a few contacts that had newsletters, and a little bit of knowledge from what we were charging at the Next Web as a big news publisher for branded content. And then it was just trial and error until we found a sweet spot that kind of worked.
Yeah, I actually did a little mini rant on Twitter yesterday about how so many newsletter publishers are doing like crappy brand like banner ads within their newsletters. It seems like the best option is always a native ad that looks like all the other editorial content, properly disclosed, of course, but all the other editorial content within the newsletter, so people will actually look at it like while they're scrolling past it. I was taking a look at your newsletter before we got on this. It seems that's the route you went. Is it's a native ad. It has a disclosure, but it's like, as you're scrolling through it, it's like a piece of editorial content within the newsletter.
Yeah, we figured out quite quickly that the more it was blended into the kind of vibe of the newsletter, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, it's not, you don't think that's everyone should be doing that, but not everybody does do it that way, or doesn't realize the importance of that. So we definitely try to build it into the structure of the newsletter, and we constantly speak with our advertisers and sponsors, and we say, look, you give us the key messages you want in your ad, give us the key kind of vibe you want to have with it, and if you wrote it, what you would write it like, send it to us, and then we will geek out it, we'll geekify it, we'll sort of tweak it to kind of in the way that I would say it and the audience is used to doing it, rather than having Matt Navarra Geek Out voice here, and then add someone else's voice that's completely alien from the newsletter back to Geek Out voice. It just stands out like a sore thumb. So, and of course, disclosure. Our disclosures are very simple. We put ad in bracket. I think people who read it will clearly see that there is a demarcation between that and the rest of the content, but only subtle, so that it's not distracting to them, that they kind of step into kind of I'm going to glaze over mode now. And so we have like an ad that's at the top, which is called the first click ad, which is one of the first 2 or 3 links at the very top of the newsletter, which has got just a small amount of text and is very blended into my intro. And then we have like a hidden gem, which is kind of still in the top section, bit more space for it to kind of be kind of expanded upon, and it's kind of a nice spotlight, but it's not quite as expensive as the first click. And then the other ad types, we have ones which have images, and we have editorialized ads where people really want to kind of have a bit more of my voice in there, but they want to have more space to expand upon on what they're wanting to talk about. Those were the ad types, and then the pricing was challenging to figure out.
How do you find advertisers?
So again, I think there's a misconception that I think it's the same for companies that come to ask me to do work for them, or it's like, oh, can we get one of your team to do this, or when's your team available? I'm like, my team? I look around and like, I don't have a team. It's me. The closest I have to an employee is Martin, really, and I hate the word to even think of Martin as an employee. Martin is a partner in the newsletter. So I don't have a team. And so I don't have somebody that's sat at a desk who is churning out kind of emails to kind of follow up warm and cold leads. I don't have loads of paid advertising, lead gen magnet things flying around and stuff like that. So it's word of mouth. People knowing me from all the other sort of media appearances I do. People who read the newsletter, who work for these companies, some of these tech startups and sort of SaaS tools, they kind of stumble across it. And this is where I think I'm very fortunate, is that in the industry of social media, which of course is what the newsletter is about, the main tool providers and the bigger companies in social, and also startups, many of them often will stumble across Geek Out or me doing something to do with social media, and so it becomes very much just comes in my inbox, falls into my inbox. Occasionally, if I see something that I think, oh, they're advertising there, or I might kind of go out to, let's see if I can follow that up. They haven't emailed me, but that's something that maybe they want to put in my newsletter. Occasionally, if I have time to do that, I'll do that. And beyond that, it really is just pure organic. And the downside to that for me is, of course, that my ad inventory, how much it's sold out, is very sporadic. Some weeks, if I've had more time and I want to sink some more time into it, or I feel I'm a bit light on money and I need to kind of get more cash in, then I'll sink a few extra hours a day kind of going out to some companies and sort of trying to warm up some leads if it's quiet. Other times it all just flows in naturally, and other times I'm just so busy and there's no ads booked and it's just the way it is, and there'll be one or no ads in there. But normally I find that I find a balance, and it flows enough to kind of make it a viable business. And yeah, if I wanted to, I could probably stick someone on a seat somewhere and get them to kind of run an ad sales role. I can't imagine it'd be the most exciting job role. I wouldn't want to do it, but there we go.
Yeah, it's the nice thing about editing a niche publication is that the people who most likely to advertise in your newsletter are also readers of your newsletter, so there's like a natural inbound process. Do you have like just a landing page, a call to action that they can land on and get the prices and the demographics and all that, or is this still a more kind of they need to email you and negotiate that way?
I've got a bit better at being more organized. I mentioned earlier on that I have ADHD. I didn't believe it to be a big thing, and I was kind of skeptical of people who say, "Well, I've got ADHD." Everyone's a bit ADHD, but it really is a big deal, certainly for me in my experience, and that does make certain types of work very hard. We haven't talked about it, but with consultancy clients I have, I'm often very transparent with them up front about the ADHD and the method I prefer to work for them to get the most value out of me. But that also sort of transpires into the way that I manage the newsletter and put things together as well. I've just gone off a complete train of thought. What your question was, though? What was what you were asking me to?
Just in terms of like how you kind of create a funnel to shuffle these advertisers, like whether it's more kind of a here's my email address, reach out and we'll talk, or like on my newsletter, like I have a very transparent advertising page that gives you every single piece of information, including a live updated Google Doc that says the availability for the ads and everything like that. And I just wanted to know where you were on that.
Yeah, and something that I could be a lot better at. I had my website mattnavarra.com redesigned, and I got the guy who was the VP of design at the Next Web because his design for the conference website was so good. So he did my website, which was really cool. And in there is a modal sort of call up box where people can kind of sign up to get the newsletter and download the deck, which has all of that information in it. And through all of my social channels, there's either a Linktree link or a direct link to the subscribe page for Geek Out. But I constantly see other newsletters and other sites where they have these very well built, obviously very well crafted funnel type sites which just have a single sign up subscribe box, and then if you subscribe it kind of keeps on pushing you. There's all these people, all this social proof that this is a great newsletter, and here's all of the great testimonials, and it keeps going, and eventually I've got to sign up for it. And I keep thinking, well, I should do that with Geek Out because we have loads of great testimonials, we have great advertisers, we have lots of social proof and things. But I guess because I haven't we haven't got problems with getting subscribers, and we haven't had challenges getting sponsors and advertisers, and this was from day one always a side hustle. This was never I'm going to start a newsletter to make loads of money or a big business out of it. It was always a little kind of fun project to see where it goes, and it kind of a project that got out of hand is kind of because it's now a large part of what I do. But I'm sure that if I did do those things, and I should do those things, then our organic inbound growth rates would be much higher than they are now. And you could say, well, why don't you then? And it's just prioritization and me liking to kind of manage me, myself, and I. And it's something I'm not very good at. It's one of the aspects of my career I'm not very good at is being organized and also managing people and growing what people call a business. Because I don't treat this as a business. I'm freelance and I happen to write a newsletter that makes money, and I happen to do some TV stuff. Although that is a business and it makes money, it's not the way I look at it. And because I don't look at it that way, I don't think of it in terms of I need to hire a new person that can manage that, and I can increase more of my earnings there if I did invested in this. And it's probably to my detriment, but it keeps on working, so I'm fine.
So, despite there not being a formal process and it being ad hoc and thought of as a side hustle, it's set to generate like what, over $200,000 this year.
Yeah, so for year one was like $150,000. Year two, 200K. This year, it probably will get past 250K for what is one email a week, a day and a half. Well, I say a day of my time, but if I added all the other bits, it probably is a bit more than that. But a lot of the work that goes into the newsletter is kind of distributed across the week because the newsletter is built on the basis of what I'm tweeting. So now I was always looking from day one, how can I justify doing what I love doing, which is just reading news stories and sharing them everywhere and talking about them? How can I make money out of it? Because otherwise, if I sit here doing that all day, I'm looking at RSS feeds, I'm not going to make any money from that. Now I can sit there and think, well, the newsletter is made from me doing that on Twitter, and therefore I can afford to do it, and that's what I do. But yeah, $250,000 from advertising and sponsorship from purely organic activity, none paid, isn't a bad gig. And it's surprised me.
No, not at all.
Um, and so that, and there's then you start thinking, okay, so how can I double that? I could probably double that. I'm not really making huge amount of effort here in terms of my capacity to kind of try harder
You
or
could just launch a second. You could just launch a second newsletter every week and then double it probably.
well, we did. So we did trial that. So we had a second newsletter. Some people who follow Geek Out stuff will remember that we had this really cool idea of a newsletter called the Diary of a Social Media Manager, and it was a really cool idea. And we had this writer that was sat behind the account that was worked in the industry who was really good, and the idea was it was written like a Dear Diary sort of thing, but it was kind of like the spilling the tea, the gossip in the industry, as well as a few kind of spotlights on stories, and then some pro tips from somebody who works in the industry. So it was kind of like an extension. It was a brand extension because it was still social media, but it wasn't all the news in one place. It was different. And from day one, we launched it. We got sponsorship from Hootsuite. Again, we're like, anyone want to sponsor it? Hootsuite, yeah, we'll sponsor it. I'm like, oh, that's surprising. Okay. So then Hootsuite sponsored it. We had advertisers, and I thought this is the model. I launched multiple newsletters. I have different writers for them. I give my kind of insights and access to my channels to help promote them and develop an audience for them. I help construct it and help bring on some advertisers, but the bulk of the creating the newsletter, publishing it and promoting it, that's the writer's responsibility, and I take a cut. And I still think that there are businesses that are doing that, and I could still do it. But again, we had challenges with the relationship with the writer, and it started to become onerous in terms of kind of what that person would want, and then what they want to develop their own personal brand. How do you manage that if you've developed it within your ecosystem and you've given them everything you've given them, and they then want to take that and then do it without having to take a cut? It starts becoming a bit chopsy then, and so that didn't work out. But the newsletter idea was great, and we still think now that we might do that, because the biggest readers of the newsletter, the people that open it most, in the top 10 number of times they've opened the email each week, is always big agencies in New York and London. They've got like UK team at bigadvertisingagency.com at 476 opens, because we know that they take it and they share it out across the whole of the organization, and they get all of that free resource. And we think we should be making some money out of that. How can we make money out of that particular group of people? So there is that.
Interesting. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what you do with that. So in terms of your tech stack, tell me about that. So it's not just what you send the newsletter with, but like what are all the like various tools you use in a given week that make like your job easier?
None of them will probably surprise many people. There are some obvious ones. So TweetDeck is heavily used. I use, I'm just looking now in front of me. So I have websites open. I have like TechMeme open. I have, what else do I have here? Talkwalker for kind of keeping up on like social mentions of my content. I use Google Alerts as well. I use my main RSS tool is still Feedly. I have about 300 RSS feeds filtered by different kind of groups of kind of topics in an RSS feed. I use Camo for the camera, which we're using today for when I do media sort of appearances. I got the Elgato Sky, the lights, air lights for lighting here, and I use a Yeti mic. So those are the main things. And then I've got Mac, computer-wise hardware, MacBook Pro, the latest MacBook Pro that's come out recently. I've got that. And then anything else that I use software-wise?
What do you use to send the newsletter?
So the newsletter was based initially on the review platform, which was funny to start with because we knew the guys who developed review from the fact that they had an office space rented from the Next Web in the co-workspace that the Next Web owned. And so we knew them when they kind of, no one knew about them. And then I decided to start a newsletter and I was like, oh, I remember you guys were at the Next Web, weren't you? And they're like, yeah. So before Twitter acquired them, we started on that platform and we struck a good deal with them because we were like mates rates, shall we say. And then we grew, and it made sense because Twitter ended up buying them, and then most of my newsletter is based around tweets and Twitter, so it was a kind of a good marriage, really. And then the features they launched in terms of one-click subscribe and pinning your newsletter to your profile, all kind of was really great help to us. But that kind of changed, I think, at the early part of this year when Twitter seemed, not only with the Elon Musk issues that the companies had and other things, but their focus on long form content has changed. And I think that they're probably, from what I can see, what I'm observing is they're going to integrate both of them together, the newsletter and the Twitter Write platform, which is or notes or whatever they're calling it now. And so the development work on the platform for the newsletter was like little to none. And soon enough, all of these upstart sort of newsletter hosting companies kind of came out of nowhere with really good features and churned out newer stuff with all this stuff that we wanted to have access to, and we didn't have those features and insights. So we decided we needed to kind of move to be able to grow and to be successful with the newsletter in the next kind of period. So we considered Substack. Substack were very keen to kind of get us to move. I had lots of kind of inbound emails or I wouldn't say desperate, but certainly they were keen to kind of find a way to persuade us that Substack was the way to go. But I couldn't see that the perks and benefits they were offering weren't substantial enough or valuable enough to me to make me want to do it. And also because we weren't a paid newsletter, which is where I think you can come into your own on Substack, we decided that Beehive, which was the place for us. And the reason why it was Beehive is because I knew the team behind it were very good in terms of they come from working at Morning Brew, and that led to very smart features that they got the development team to create for their platform. And we spoke to them. They seemed like a cool bunch, and they got what we wanted to do. We struck a good deal, and then we moved, and it's been good.
Yeah, I feel like we could dedicate a whole episode on why or how Twitter shit the bed with its review acquisition. But we're out of time for today. Matt, thanks so much for joining me today. Where can people find you online?
So yes, if you want to sort of subscribe to the newsletter, then it's geekout.mattnavarra.com, and then my website is also mattnavarra.com. Elsewhere, usual things, Twitter @mattnavarra, and the Geek Out group on Facebook. Look for Social Geek Out and you'll find the group.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.